The formidable USS Duncan was meticulously prepared for naval engagement. Her commanding officer had diligently absorbed every operational manual, subjecting his crew to relentless drills. Consequently, when the sinister wakes of Japanese torpedoes sliced through the inky waters off Tsavo Island on October 11, 1942, he initiated the textbook defensive maneuver, a sharp turn of the rudder, maximum engine speed, and an erratic zigzag course designed to confound the enemy's aim. His crew, initially confident, watched with escalating dread as the phosphorescent trails converged, revealing the torpedoes' unnerving ability to adjust their trajectory, relentlessly tracking every evasive shift. Within a matter of minutes, two devastating Type 93 torpedoes violently impacted the Duncan's hull, sending her to the ocean floor and claiming the lives of 195 brave sailors. The tragic fate of the Duncan was not an isolated incident. Throughout 1942, American destroyer captains across the Solomon Islands witnessed the same horrifying scenario unfold repeatedly. They would invariably detect the telltale wakes, issue urgent orders for emergency turns, yet still endure crippling hits. This disturbing pattern was undeniably consistent and utterly terrifying. Vessels adhering strictly to established naval doctrine were succumbing to enemy attacks. The USS Porter, the USS Barton, and the USS De Haven all executed the prescribed evasive maneuvers, only to meet the same grim destiny at the bottom of the sea. Navy analysts delved deeply into after-action reports, survivor testimonies, and intricate radar plots, desperately seeking the underlying commonality. Their findings profoundly challenged decades of ingrained service teachings. The statistical evidence was undeniably damning. During the initial 11 months of the Pacific War, American destroyers employing traditional evasive tactics against Japanese torpedoes exhibited a dismal survival rate of merely 37%. This meant that more than 6 out of every 10 ships attempting to evade by turning away were struck. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please leave a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Initially, senior naval officers attributed these catastrophic losses to deficiencies in crew training, equipment malfunctions, or simply unfortunate circumstances. However, the consistency of the figures was too compelling to ignore. Experienced captains commanding highly skilled crews were perishing at precisely the same rate as novice skippers on their inaugural patrols. The destroyer force was suffering immense casualties, and the perplexing question remained: why were the established rules that had proven effective in the Atlantic against German U-boats failing so catastrophically in the Pacific theater? Compounding the crisis was the psychological impact of this challenge to institutional confidence. Destroyer doctrine, ever since the First World War, had steadfastly emphasized the inherent advantage of maneuverability. Destroyers were considered the swift greyhounds of the fleet, exceptionally fast, remarkably nimble, and specifically engineered to evade threats with agile movements. Captains had dedicated their entire careers to training on the fundamental principle that a rapidly moving target executing radical course changes was virtually impossible to hit. They had witnessed this principle validated in countless exercises and had meticulously studied historical engagements where zigzagging maneuvers had demonstrably saved ships from destruction. This doctrine was not merely a set of tactical guidelines. It represented an unwavering institutional faith. When that deeply held faith began to result in the deaths of crews, it precipitated a crisis that extended far beyond conventional naval strategy penetrating into the very psychology of command and leadership. By the middle of 1942, destroyer captains found themselves confronted with an agonizing dilemma: adhere to established doctrine and face a probable demise, or abandon decades of naval wisdom without a clear alternative course of action. No one possessed an adequate answer. Some captains began to improvise their own techniques, developing radical variations of standard patterns in a desperate attempt to become unpredictable. Such efforts, however, rarely yielded success. Others sought transfers to different theaters of war, where the established rules still held relevance. A disheartening few simply froze in the heat of combat, paralyzed by the chilling realization that everything they had learned was fundamentally flawed. The South Pacific destroyer force was rapidly approaching a critical breaking point, a vulnerability that the Japanese forces were acutely aware of. Their calculated torpedo tactics were not merely achieving physical destruction. They were also winning a significant psychological war. The weapon relentlessly hunting American destroyers was far more than just another torpedo. The Japanese Type 93, famously dubbed Long Lance by Allied intelligence officers, who finally managed to capture an intact specimen in early 1943, represented a monumental technological leap that fundamentally rewrote the established rules of naval combat. Powered by pure oxygen instead of conventional compressed air, it produced an almost imperceptible wake, could travel at an astonishing speed of 49 knots for a remarkable distance of 22 miles, and carried a colossal 1,080-pound warhead, nearly double the explosive power of American torpedoes. However, the true lethality of the Long Lance did not solely reside in its impressive speed or destructive power. It was its advanced guidance system, which American tacticians failed to comprehend, until countless lives had been tragically lost. Traditional torpedoes operated on a straight-line trajectory. They were fired, and success depended on the accuracy of the initial aim and the hope that the target would not alter its course before impact. American doctrine had been meticulously crafted to exploit this very limitation. A ship traveling at 30 knots, for instance, could traverse 1,000 yards in just over a minute. If lookouts detected torpedo wakes at a distance of 2,000 yards and the captain immediately ordered a turn perpendicular to their track, the ship would theoretically cross their path before their arrival, presenting only its narrow stern as the weapons harmlessly passed by. This mathematical calculation worked flawlessly against straight-running torpedoes. The Long Lance, however, was not a straight-running weapon. Japanese engineers had equipped the Type 93 with a highly sophisticated gyroscopic guidance system capable of executing continuous course corrections throughout its entire run. Even more critically, Japanese destroyer doctrine mandated the firing of torpedoes in wide, overlapping spreads, typically 5, 7, or even 9 weapons launched in a fan-like pattern covering an expansive 1,500 yards of ocean. Each individual torpedo within this spread was meticulously set to run at a slightly different depth and angle, creating a deadly net. When an American destroyer captain issued an order for an evasive turn, he was not merely attempting to dodge a single torpedo. Instead, he was inadvertently steering his vessel directly into a predetermined kill zone, where multiple weapons were already strategically positioned to intercept any turn radius he might choose. The geometry of this situation was nothing short of diabolical. An American destroyer executing a hard turn to port at 35 knots would sweep through an arc of approximately 1,000 yards, requiring roughly 45 seconds to complete a 90-degree course change. During those critical 45 seconds, the ship would expose its entire 350-foot length, its full broadside, to the incoming torpedo spread. The Japanese had precisely calculated this vulnerability. Their firing solutions anticipated the exact nature of the evasive turn. They aimed not at the ship's current location, but rather at the precise point where doctrine dictated she would be during her escape maneuver. Consequently, every captain who diligently followed the established protocols was unwittingly steering his vessel directly into the jaws of the spread. Commander Tamachihara, a pivotal figure in refining Japanese destroyer tactics in 1941, later documented in his combat diary that American predictability constituted their greatest weakness. "We trained for 6 months doing nothing but firing at targets that maneuvered," he recorded. The Americans always turned the same way, always at maximum rudder, always maintaining speed. It made our calculations simple. By late 1942, Japanese torpedo crews were achieving astonishing hit rates exceeding 60% against evading destroyers, a rate 3 times higher than against ships that maintained a steady course. The American response, ironically, was directly contributing to American casualties. The oxygen propulsion system introduced yet another lethal dimension to the long lance. Conventional compressed air torpedoes left discernible bubble trails, affording alert lookouts precious seconds to react and potentially initiate evasive action. The long lance's oxygen combustion, however, was remarkably efficient, producing minimal exhaust. Consequently, American lookouts often only detected the wakes when torpedoes were within 800 yards, a mere 30 seconds or less from impact at closing speeds. With such an incredibly brief warning window, a captain had time for perhaps only one helm order. If that single order proved incorrect, his ship was doomed. The technological disparity was not merely about superior weaponry, it was about American doctrine being tragically designed for an adversary that had ceased to exist. On the night of October 11, 1942, Frederick Moosbrugger, the commander of Destroyer Division 12, was not seeking to revolutionize naval warfare, he was simply striving for survival. His 4 destroyers, the USS Fahrenholt, USS Buchanan, USS McCalla, and USS Laffey, were engaged in screening cruisers near Guadalcanal when lookouts spotted torpedo wakes knifing through the water at a distance of 2,200 yards. Moosbrugger had approximately 40 seconds to make a life-or-death decision. Every instinct, every hour of rigorous training, screamed at him to turn away, present the stern, and run from the threat. He froze, not from fear, but from a profound sense of confusion. The wakes were not originating from the expected direction. His radar indicated Japanese destroyers to starboard. Yet these particular torpedoes were approaching from an unusual 30-degree angle off his port bow. If he turned away, as doctrine unequivocally demanded, he would swing his broadside directly into their destructive path. However, if he maintained his current course, they would pass harmlessly down his starboard side. The geometry seemed illogical, yet the act of turning felt like an undeniable suicide mission. Therefore, Moosbrugger made a decision no American destroyer captain had ever made in combat. He ordered a hard left rudder, turning his vessel toward the incoming torpedoes, and called for flank speed. His bridge crew was convinced he had lost his sanity. The helmsman actually hesitated before executing the order, an act of insubordination that Moosbrugger remarkably never reported. The Fahrenholt's bow swung sharply left, pointing directly at the menacing incoming wakes. The destroyer rapidly accelerated to 34 knots, charging headlong at weapons specifically designed to sink her. Through his binoculars, Moosbrugger watched the phosphorescent trails grow brighter, closer. With agonizing speed, his ship was now irrevocably committed. At 800 yards, he could discern individual bubbles within the wakes. At 400 yards, lookouts were frantically screaming bearings. Then, at a mere 200 yards, Moosbrugger realized with overwhelming relief that he was going to survive. The torpedoes passed, 1 to port and 2 to starboard, missing the Fahrenholt by incredibly narrow margins of 40 and 60 feet, respectively. From the destroyer's deck, sailors could have, in theory, tossed life jackets onto the passing weapons, yet they missed. All 3 long lances continued their run past the destroyer. Their spread pattern, meticulously designed to catch a ship turning away, was utterly defeated by a vessel charging directly forward. Moosbrugger's accidental geometry had brilliantly confounded Japanese calculations. He had dramatically shrunk his target profile from a vulnerable 350 feet of broadside to a mere 35 feet of bow width. More significantly, he had traversed the critical kill zone in a lightning-fast 8 seconds, instead of the 45 seconds a traditional turnaway maneuver would have required. The sophisticated torpedoes simply had insufficient time to adjust their deadly trajectories. The naval officer, Moosbrugger, initially failed to fully discern the profound implications of his recent, startling discovery. His official after-action report, filed on October 13th, simply characterized the maneuver as an emergency course correction designed to avoid entering the spread pattern. He humbly ascribed his survival to a combination of sheer luck and the vigilance of his lookouts. Regrettably, naval analysts embedded within Pearl Harbor's extensive filing system interred the report amidst a deluge of conventional paperwork, dismissing it as merely another instance of a destroyer experiencing a fortunate escape. Yet, Moosbrugger himself found his thoughts incessantly drawn back to those pivotal 8 seconds. He recognized with growing unease that he had acted contrary to established doctrine, yet paradoxically had executed everything precisely in accordance with the laws of physics. The fundamental query that plagued his waking hours and haunted his sleep was whether this extraordinary outcome could ever be intentionally replicated. A mere 3 weeks subsequent to that initial encounter, specifically on November 2nd, Moosbrugger unexpectedly encountered his definitive answer. Japanese destroyers, under the shroud of night, unleashed another devastating torpedo spread at his division during a fierce surface engagement off Lunga Point. This time, however, he demonstrated an unflinching resolve. He executed a radical maneuver, steering hard rudder directly toward the approaching wakes, engaging maximum velocity, and adopting a bow-on approach. Miraculously, 5 torpedoes veered past his vessel by similarly narrow margins. Following this second astonishing survival, Moosbrugger ceased attributing his deliverance to mere chance. He now boldly coined it a distinct technique. His succinct radio message, dispatched to other destroyer captains operating in the vicinity, conveyed a revolutionary suggestion. Suggest trying different approach to torpedo evasion. Charging toward appears more effective than turning away. Recommend consideration. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please leave a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The seismic message transmitted by Moosbrugger reached Commander Arleigh Burke on November 8th. Burke, having already endured the painful loss of several comrades who had adhered strictly to conventional doctrine, found himself prepared to embrace such an unorthodox strategy, even if it bordered on heresy. Arleigh Burke meticulously reread Moosbrugger's message no fewer than 3 times before promptly convening his squadron commanders aboard his flagship vessel, the USS Charles Osborne. What he was about to propose transgressed every foundational principle they had absorbed during their rigorous training at Annapolis. Established naval doctrine, a lineage stretching back to the very age of sail, unequivocally instructed commanders to minimize target exposure, present the smallest possible profile, pivot away from perceived threats, and assiduously increase distance. This was not merely a matter of tactical methodology. It was an ingrained survival instinct, hardwired deep within human psychology. When confronted with imminent danger, the natural primal impulse is to repel from it, not to advance directly into its path. Burke was, in essence, asking his captains to consciously counteract millions of years of deep-seated evolutionary programming, all while immersed in the chaos of nocturnal combat, with only fleeting seconds available for a life-or-death decision. While the underlying physics appeared theoretically sound on paper, a mere schematic diagram could never truly capture the profound emotional burden of issuing an order to steer one's vessel directly into the path of a weapon capable of tearing it devastatingly in half. Commander Bernard Austin, the resolute captain of the USS Spence, articulated this sentiment forthrightly during the crucial meeting. "You're asking me to drive at something that's coming to kill me at a combined closing speed of 80 knots. If I misjudge by 3 seconds or 5 degrees, I don't get another chance. My ship becomes a coffin for 329 men." Burke, in his wisdom, conceded the validity of Austin's grim assessment. He simply pointed out, with unvarnished candor, that slavishly following established doctrine had already transformed a dozen American destroyers into watery coffins. At the very least, he argued, the radical strategy of charging toward the torpedoes offered an alternative calculation, a new chance at survival. The pivotal computation that ultimately persuaded the doubters revolved around the intricate targeting problem. A long-lance torpedo, traversing the water at an impressive 49 knots, covered a distance of 83 feet per second. An American destroyer, accelerating at flank speed, spanned 58 feet per second. When these two formidable forces approached each other directly, their converging velocity reached an astonishing 141 feet per second. The approximate bow width of a destroyer, the minimal target the torpedo absolutely had to strike, was roughly 35 feet. At these breakneck combined closing speeds, the torpedo's sophisticated guidance system possessed only a momentary interval of 0.24 seconds to execute any final critical adjustments. Considering that average human reaction time hovers around 0.25 seconds, it became evident that the torpedo's mechanical gyroscope was inherently unable to correct its trajectory swiftly enough to achieve a direct hit on an oncoming bow. In stark contrast, consider the conventional turnaway maneuver. A destroyer executing a broadside swing would transverse perpendicularly to the torpedo's track at a speed of 30 knots, equivalent to 44 feet per second. However, her flank span measured a considerable 350 feet, and she would spend a protracted 45 seconds executing the full turn. Consequently, the torpedo was presented with a vastly expanded target, 10 times larger, available for a prolonged duration nearly 200 times longer. Japanese gunners had meticulously pre-calibrated their torpedo spreads for exactly this anticipated scenario. They had precisely calculated lead angles, depth settings, and timing, all predicated on the assumption that American ships would inevitably turn away. Thus, every captain who adhered to the conventional doctrine was, unwittingly, sailing into a predetermined snare. Burke's strategic breakthrough transcended mere intricate geometry. He keenly perceived that the act of charging torpedoes initiated a decision cascade that distinctly benefited the Americans. If a captain detected torpedo wakes at 2,000 yards and promptly veered toward them, he effectively compelled the Japanese torpedo crews to improvise their calculations on the fly. Their meticulously pre-planned spreads were instantly rendered obsolete. The torpedoes themselves were already running on inflexible, predetermined courses. By modifying a destroyer's behavior after the weapons were already in the water, those torpedoes were afforded no means to adapt. Crucially, the Americans thereby regained the upper hand, seizing the initiative, a strategic advantage they had conspicuously lacked in every previous engagement. However, Burke was also acutely cognizant of the technique's inherent constraints. It demanded flawless implementation. Captains needed to discern torpedo wakes early, optimally, beyond 500 yards. They also had to accurately assess the torpedo's trajectory angle to precisely determine the correct direction for their turn. Charging toward wakes approaching from dead ahead, it was understood, was unequivocally lethal. Such a move would drive the vessel straight into the path of the incoming weapons. The technique was only viable for wakes bearing between 20 degrees and 70 degrees off the bow. Inside these precise operational parameters, physics distinctly advantaged the destroyer. Operating outside this critical envelope, however, guaranteed that the ship and its crew would perish. Burke devoted the month of November to rigorously training his squadron on wake identification, angle appraisal, and rapid tactical choices. He was, in essence, imparting knowledge to his captains on how to calculate complex geometry while under intense pressure, in the dead of night, amidst the chaos of battle. On November 25th, they would face the ultimate proving ground to ascertain if intensive training could truly surmount innate impulse. The underpinning mathematics that ultimately preserved destroyers came down to trigonometry, a subject most captains hadn't revisited since their academy days. Burke's operations officer, Lieutenant Robert Copeland, spent 3 intensive weeks in November 1943 devising a tactical reference card that condensed complex geometry into instantaneous choices. The compact dimensions of the card, measuring 3 and x5 in, were encased in plastic, specifically designed to fit conveniently into a captain as shirt pocket. On one side, an illustrative schematic depicted ideal turn angles based on torpedo wake bearings. On the reverse side, the card presented the unflinching calculations that unequivocally explained the technique. Efficacy. Consider first the target area. A Fletcher-class destroyer, when viewed from its frontal aspect, presented a mere 35 ft of bow width. This was effectively a rectangle 35 ft wide by 45 ft tall above the waterline, totaling 1,475 square feet of exposed surface. Now pivot that same destroyer 90 degrees into a broadside turn. She then exhibited a length of 350 ft by a height of 45 ft, equating to a massive 15,750 square feet, a considerably larger target area. precisely 10 times greater. A torpedo spread encompassing with 500 yards of ocean had a scant 4.2% likelihood of hitting a charging bow. That identical spread, however, possessed a substantial 47% chance of impacting a turning broadside. The Japanese had calibrated their tactical maneuvers specifically around those 47% probabilities. Time exposure further amplified this critical effect. Transversing a torpedo, as trajectory bow, first at a 45-degree angle, typically took between 6 and 10 seconds, contingent upon the destroyer's speed and the torpedo's angle of approach. During those brief seconds, the ship's susceptible region, the actual impact zone, persisted at 1,575 square feet. In stark contrast, an extended turning maneuver consumed 45 to 52 seconds and exposed the full 15,750 square feet throughout its entire duration. The math was unsparingly clear. Charging diminished exposure time by a remarkable 80% and concurrently reduced the target area by 90%. The cumulative impact of these reductions precipitously lowered the hit probability from 47% to less than 2%. Copeland's card additionally featured another pivotal computation, the torpedo's turning radius. A long lance traveling at 49 knots simply could not maneuver adeptly. Its gyroscopic guidance system possessed the capability to adjust its course, but inherent physical constraints limited how quickly it could do so. At full speed, a Type 93 torpedo required approximately 400 yards to execute a 90-degree turn. Consequently, when an American destroyer charged at torpedo wakes and successfully intercepted their track, any torpedo that missed had to subsequently execute a turn, decelerate, re-engage the target, and then accelerate once more. That entire sequence of consecutive actions consumed between 18 and 22 seconds, an age in the frenetic pace of naval combat. Crucially, this process pushed the torpedo beyond its operational parameters, effectively nullifying its threat. A weapon that missed a charging destroyer rarely, if ever, got a second chance to strike. The closing speed differential represented the culminating factor. When a destroyer turned away from incoming torpedoes, she inevitably diminished their comparative velocity. A torpedo pursuing at 49 knots, chasing a destroyer evading at 35 knots, exhibited a closing speed of just 14 knots, equivalent to 24 feet per second. This provided the torpedo's guidance system with sufficient opportunity to fine-tune its corrections, adjust for the target's evasive turns, and efficiently sustain engagement. However, when a destroyer charged directly toward the torpedoes, the relative velocity skyrocketed to 84 knots, 141 feet per second. The guidance system, under such extreme conditions, simply could not assimilate information and process updates fast enough. It was akin to attempting to swat a fly with a sledgehammer while both were running at full speed in opposite directions. The human eye cannot perceive objects moving that rapidly relative to each other, nor could the contemporary 1943 mechanical gyroscopes. Burke instructed his squadron commanders to commit one single digit to memory, 8. If they perceived torpedo wakes and immediately turned toward them, they faced approximately 8 seconds of peak peril. These were 8 seconds where unblemished operation was paramount. These were 8 seconds where a fatal error meant certain death. Yet 8 seconds of intense danger was immeasurably superior to 45 seconds of exposed flank. The human brain, he reasoned, could endure 8 seconds of terror. Most captains, however, struggled to maintain sustained rational thought for 45 seconds while monitoring torpedoes tracking their turns. Clearly, psychology mattered, equally as much as physics, in these dire situations. The USS O'Bannon had shadowed Japanese destroyers for an extended period of 3 hours through the Kula Gulf on the night of January the 23rd, 1943. Commander Donald MacDonald had thoroughly assimilated Burke's rigorous training, rigorously training his crew until wake identification became an instinctive reflex. When his lookouts alerted him to luminescent trails at 1/800 yards, indicated at bearing 035 relative to his position, MacDonald dispensed with the need for his reference card. The wakes were situated within the operational parameters, specifically 35 to grain off his port bow. Without hesitation, he unhesitatingly commanded left hard rudder and maximum forward thrust. This engagement marked the pioneering application, the first intentional and planned execution, of the charging tactic. Moosbrugger's initial discovery had been a fortuitous escape. MacDonald's ease, by contrast, represented a calculated decision, a deliberate tactical choice. The decision made by MacDonald was a shrewd tactical maneuver. The destroyer O'Bannon surged through the water at an impressive speed of 36 knots, its bow slicing toward the discernible wakes left by incoming torpedoes. On the bridge, MacDonald meticulously counted the seconds allowed, a disciplined practice he had cultivated during his training, to maintain mental acuity and focus on the geometrical aspects of the situation, rather than succumbing to fear. Simultaneously, his gunnery officer, with keen eyes fixed on binoculars, relayed critical adjustments, reporting, "Wakes now bearing 30, sir. Range 1,200. MacDonald, however, consciously disregarded the range. Understanding its irrelevance, it was the angle that held paramount importance. As long as the wakes remained within a precise arc of 20 to 40 degrees off the bow, the fundamental laws of physics would inherently favor his vessel. Within 4 seconds, the distinct streams of bubbles became individually visible, and by 6 seconds, the crew could audibly discern the high-pitched whine of the torpedo's engines, a piercing sound that managed to cut through the destroyer's own considerable machinery noise. At the critical 7-second mark, the initial long-lance torpedo passed a mere 52 feet to port. Moments later, a second torpedo traversed O'Bannon's bow with an even tighter clearance of 38 feet. A third, entirely unseen by MacDonald, streaked down the starboard side, passing with less than 30 feet of separation. So close, in fact, that sailors on the deck distinctly felt the pressure wave push against the ship's hull. Then, as swiftly as it began, O'Bannon burst through the dangerous spread, accelerating beyond the immediate kill zone. The entire harrowing engagement had transpired in just 9 seconds. Remarkably, not a single torpedo altered its course to pursue the vessel. Their guidance systems had lost track of the target before any corrective calculations could be made. MacDonald's initial count had been off by a single second, yet he and his crew had survived. The true test, however, was yet to unfold, arriving a mere 30 seconds later, when Japanese destroyers, in a desperate attempt, launched a second spread of 6 torpedoes as O'Bannon continued to close in on gunnery range. MacDonald, ever vigilant, detected the new wakes at a distance of 2,400 yards, bearing 50 relative. While this position lay slightly outside the optimal engagement envelope, it was not by a significant margin. This time he executed a turn to the right, strategically exposing his starboard bow to the impending threat. The core principle of the technique remained consistent. It was not the direction of the charge that mattered, but the act of charging itself. O'Bannon once again surged forward with determination. Consequently, the 6 long lances converged precisely where the vessel would have been had MacDonald chosen to turn away. Instead, O'Bannon was actually 200 yards closer than the Japanese had anticipated. resulting in all 6 torpedoes missing their mark by margins exceeding 100 feet. We would be incredibly grateful if you would stay with us and watch the end of the video. Your like and subscription would mean a lot to us. Please also consider leaving a comment about where you are from and what your thoughts are on the video topic. McDonald's comprehensive after-action report arrived at Burke's headquarters at 0900 on January 24th. Unlike Moose Brugger, somewhat tentative description of events, McDonald SOS's account was remarkably definitive and unequivocal, deliberately turned toward torpedo wakes per new doctrine. Result, 0 hits from 9 confirmed weapons. Technique is sound. Recommend fleet-wide implementation. Burke, recognizing the profound significance of this breakthrough, promptly forwarded the report to Admiral William Halsey, appending a cover memorandum that formally requested permission to elevate this charging tactic to official doctrine for all destroyer forces operating in the South Pacific. Halsey, who had tragically lost 11 destroyers to torpedo attacks in the preceding year of 1942, approved the urgent request within a swift 6-hour window. By January 27th, every American destroyer captain stationed within the theater had received detailed tactical bulletins thoroughly describing the newly implemented technique. However, the chasm between merely reading about the audacious act of charging torpedoes and actually executing it in the chaotic reality of combat remained vast. McDonald had achieved a flawless execution because he had diligently drilled the maneuver an astonishing 63 times throughout November and December. Most other destroyer captains, in stark contrast, had not practiced it even once. Burke astutely recognized this critical disparity between theoretical doctrine and practical combat execution. Issuing new orders was a relatively straightforward task. However, rewiring deeply ingrained human survival instincts demanded a far more intensive approach. Consequently, in February 1943, Burke established a rigorous 3-day training course at Purvis Bay, specifically designed to focus exclusively on torpedo evasion. Every destroyer rotating into the South Pacific was mandated to spend 72 hours doing nothing but relentlessly practicing the charging technique. While this duration was acknowledged as insufficient to render the maneuver truly instinctive, it was deemed adequate to make its execution possible under duress. Arleigh Burke assumed command of Destroyer Squadron 23, famously known by its call sign Little Beavers, in May 1943, driven by a singular, overriding obsession to render the charging technique so utterly automatic that his captains would execute it flawlessly even under the most dire and challenging conditions imaginable. He meticulously drilled scenarios encompassing night combat, enforced radio silence, mechanical failures, and even casualties on the bridge. Situations where everything conceivably could go wrong. Yet captains still had to make the counterintuitive turn toward the perceived danger instead of instinctively turning away from it. Burke profoundly understood that doctrine, however brilliant, held no meaning if the overwhelming stress of combat caused rational thought to collapse. The technique, he insisted, had to transcend conscious decision-making and become a deeply encoded muscle memory, ingrained far more profoundly than primal fear. Burke's innovative training philosophy drew its inspiration not from traditional naval conventions, but remarkably, from the rigorous methods employed by fire departments. Firefighters, for instance, instinctively rush toward burning buildings because they have meticulously practiced that exact movement thousands of times. This relentless repetition effectively overwrites their innate self-preservation instincts. Burke applied this identical logic to his destroyer captains. Every single night exercise incorporated realistic torpedo simulations, with friendly destroyers assuming the role of Japanese attackers, firing practice spreads marked with phosphorescent dye. Captains were rigorously trained to spot these glowing wakes, precisely calculate the critical angles, and then courageously charge. Burke orchestrated 10 such simulations per night, 4 nights per week. After a mere 6 weeks of this intensive regimen, his squadron commanders ceased to consciously think about the maneuver. They simply executed it, with precision and without hesitation. The standardization of tactics extended beyond individual ships to encompass comprehensive squadron-level strategies. Burke meticulously developed a sophisticated coordination protocol for multiple destroyers confronting the same torpedo spread. In scenarios where 2 American ships simultaneously detected the same wakes, the lead vessel would courageously charge forward, while the trailing ship would either maintain its current course or deliberately turn away, thereby creating an element of unpredictability that effectively shattered the Japanese firing solutions. Conversely, if wakes appeared between ships within a formation, both vessels would execute a coordinated turn toward the torpedoes from opposite directions, strategically splitting the spread and forcing the incoming weapons to choose between targets. The Japanese had meticulously designed their tactics predicated on the expectation of predictable American responses. Burke, with his innovative approach, instead presented them with calculated chaos. Communication, however, emerged as a potential weak link in the intricate tactical chain. Radio transmissions consumed precious seconds and were also susceptible to jamming or interception by the enemy. Burke ingeniously addressed this vulnerability by instituting a visual signal system utilizing colored searchlights. A green flash signified charging left, a red flash indicated charging right, and a white flash conveyed the order to hold course. This simple yet effective system allowed captains to coordinate their responses in under 2 seconds, all without compromising critical radio silence. During the intense Battle of Kula Gulf on July 5th, Burke's destroyers were confronted with an immense 17-torpedo spread, representing the largest single launch the Japanese had deployed to date. Employing the newly established light signals, 3 destroyers executed a synchronized charge from different angles, while 2 others maintained their original course. The outcome was nothing short of extraordinary. 14 torpedoes missed their targets completely, and 3 impacted the empty ocean where the destroyers would have been positioned had they adhered to the outdated doctrine. Crucially, 0 American ships sustained any damage whatsoever. Burke also successfully resolved the persistent recognition problem that had plagued earlier implementations of torpedo evasion. Spotting torpedo wakes at a distance of 1,800 yards on a moonless night typically demanded exceptional lookouts and a significant measure of good fortune. While Burke understood he could not control luck, he could demonstrably enhance the capabilities of his lookouts. He instituted a rigorous rotation system wherein the top 10% of each crew were assigned 4-hour shifts on dedicated wake spotting duty. These individuals had no other responsibilities. Their sole focus was scanning the water for the telltale phosphorescent trails. Furthermore, he equipped his destroyers with portable spotlights fitted with red filters. which significantly enhanced the visibility of the phosphorescent glow without compromising precious night vision. Consequently, the average wake detection range improved dramatically from an average of 1,200 yards to an impressive 2,100 yards. This crucial extra 900 yards translated directly into an additional 7 seconds of vital decision-making time. By September 1943, Destroyer Squadron 23 had engaged in torpedo attacks across 11 separate combat engagements. Their survival rate stood at an astonishing 100%. Not a single ship had been hit. A total of 68 torpedoes were successfully evaded using the charging technique. These statistics were so exceptionally extraordinary that naval intelligence initially harbored suspicions that Burke might be falsifying his reports. To validate these remarkable claims, they dispatched an observer team. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Eccles spent 3 weeks embedded with the squadron, actively participating in 2 combat actions and meticulously observing training operations. His report, filed on October 12th, included the unequivocal phrase, "The technique is legitimate, repeatable, and represents the most significant tactical innovation in destroyer warfare since the adoption of radar." Burke's unparalleled success garnered widespread attention far beyond the immediate confines of the South Pacific Theater. By October 1943, destroyer squadrons operating in the Central Pacific, the Aleutian Islands, and even the Atlantic were urgently requesting training materials and the transfer of experienced instructors. The charging technique was rapidly disseminating organically throughout the entire destroyer force, passed from captain to captain through the informal yet highly effective networks that connected the Navy's most aggressive and innovative commanders. What had initially begun as one man's desperate improvisation was now rapidly evolving into institutional knowledge. The critical question that now loomed was whether this formidable technique would prove equally effective against Japan's most skilled destroyer captains, who were themselves beginning to adapt their own tactics to counter the burgeoning American unpredictability. The date was November 25, 1943, and the location was Cape St. George, situated southeast of New Ireland. Burke's renowned Little Beavers had been relentlessly hunting Japanese destroyers for 6 consecutive nights, shadowing the crucial Tokyo Express supply runs that were vital for sustaining Japanese garrisons in the northern Solomons. On this particular night, radar contact unequivocally confirmed the presence of 5 enemy destroyers engaged in a southbound run. Burke commanded an equally matched force of 5 destroyers, the Charles Osborne, Dyson, Claxton, Spence, and Converse. While the forces were numerically balanced, Burke possessed distinct advantages that the Japanese were entirely unaware of. His crews had executed the charging technique so many times that it had become second nature, an ingrained reflex. The Japanese, conversely, still harbored the expectation that American ships would predictably turn away from the incoming torpedoes. At precisely 0141 hours, a formidable trio of Japanese destroyers, Onami, Makinami, and Agano, executed a meticulously coordinated torpedo launch. A total of 13 devastating long-lance torpedoes were unleashed, fanning out in a calculated pattern designed to ensnare Burke's naval formation regardless of any evasive maneuvers the American vessels might attempt. Remarkably, Burke's vigilant lookouts detected the telltale wakes of these incoming threats from a distance of 2,300 yards. This perilous situation was the exact scenario that Burke had tirelessly drilled his crews to confront, multiple torpedo wakes converging from various angles, demanding instantaneous and synchronized reactions across his 5-ship squadron. In a swift, decisive signal, Burke's green searchlight flashed twice, initiating a complex, pre-planned evasion. The destroyers Osborne and Dyson veered sharply to port, while Claxton steadfastly maintained its original trajectory. Simultaneously, Spence and Converse executed an aggressive turn to starboard. In a breathtaking display of precision, 5 American destroyers performed 5 distinct, yet harmonized, maneuvers in a single, critical moment. The meticulously orchestrated Japanese torpedo spread, which had been precisely calibrated for enemy ships that were expected to retreat and consolidate their positions, ultimately found nothing but an expanse of undisturbed ocean. The 13 formidable torpedoes passed harmlessly through the very space where Burke's destroyers were anticipated to be. Their varied depths and angles, specifically engineered to strike broadside targets, proved utterly irrelevant against an enemy that had vanished from their intended impact zones. The Osborne skillfully navigated the northern perimeter of the spread, achieving a perilous clearance of merely 45 feet. The Dyson, positioned centrally, traversed the heart of the torpedo onslaught, with torpedoes narrowly missing on both sides, the closest by a mere 33 feet. The Spence, displaying audacious courage, charged through the southern edge with such aggression that her lookouts astonishingly reported witnessing a torpedo pass directly beneath the ship, its depth setting fortunately too shallow to activate its formidable warhead. 5 distinct vessels, each carving its own unique path through what should have been a deadly kill zone, emerged completely unscathed. There were 0 hits. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Then, in a move that completely defied the expectations of the Japanese commanders, Burke did not withdraw after successfully evading the torpedoes. Instead, he boldly pressed forward, closing the distance to engage at gunnery range. His squadron, affectionately known as the Little Beavers, unleashed a torrent of fire from their 5-inch guns at a range of 4,200 yards, catching the Japanese destroyers in a vulnerable moment as they were still in the process of reloading their torpedo tubes. The Onami bore the brunt of this sudden assault, sustaining an astonishing 17 direct hits within the initial 90 seconds, culminating in a catastrophic explosion. The Makinami, attempting a desperate maneuver to launch a second wave of torpedoes, inadvertently turned directly into Claxton's expertly calculated firing solution, absorbing 11 direct hits amidships. She was immediately rendered dead in the water, engulfed in flames. The Japanese strategists had meticulously prepared for a classic torpedo duel, but Burke, with his audacious tactics, presented them with an entirely unexpected gunfight. At 01:56, the remaining Japanese destroyers, Agano, Yugiri, and Uzuki, launched a desperate second spread of torpedoes. This time, 19 torpedoes were fired in a frantic, last-ditch effort as the ships turned to make their escape. Burke's response was nothing short of clinical precision. His destroyers had maintained their disciplined formation throughout the preceding gunnery engagement, specifically preparing for this very moment. As the telltale wakes reappeared, the Little Beavers flawlessly replicated their split response maneuver. 2 ships charged to the port side, 1 held its course, and 2 others aggressively turned to starboard. 19 torpedoes subsequently missed their targets by even wider margins than the initial spread. In a span of just 15 minutes, the Japanese had expended 32 long lances against Burke's destroyers. 32 sophisticated, oxygen-propelled, gyroscopically guided weapons that had, in 1942, sent dozens of American ships to the depths of the ocean. Yet not a single one found its mark. Burke, relentless in his pursuit, chased the fleeing Japanese destroyers for an additional hour, ultimately sinking the Makinami with sustained gunfire at Iwo-223 and inflicting severe damage upon the Agano, which limped back to Rabaul, never to participate in combat again. Upon the Little Beaver's return to Purvis Bay on November 26th, Burke's after-action report was remarkably concise, engaged 5 enemy destroyers, evaded 32 torpedo attacks using charging technique, sank 3 enemy vessels, damaged 2 others, own casualties, 0 personnel, 0 ships damaged. Admiral Halsey's subsequent response was notably more effusive. Congratulations on a perfect execution. Your technique has fundamentally altered destroyer warfare in this theater. Recommend immediate Navy Cross for tactical innovation. The Battle of Cape St. George rapidly became the quintessential validation case study. Instructors at the Naval War College would meticulously analyze its intricacies for decades, utilizing it as a prime example of how ingenious tactical innovation could effectively surmount technological disadvantages. However, for the destroyer captains still actively engaged in the brutal Pacific conflict, the battle's profound significance was far simpler. Aggressively charging toward incoming torpedoes demonstrably worked, even under ideal combat conditions and against Japan's most seasoned destroyer crews. This audacious technique was no longer merely a desperate improvisation. It had been rigorously proven and elevated to established doctrine. The pertinent question now shifted from, does it work, to the more pressing, how do we effectively instruct every captain in the fleet to master this? The U.S. Navy's destroyer training facility at Pearl Harbor underwent a radical and comprehensive transformation in January 1944. Commander Ellis Reed, who was specifically appointed to completely overhaul the tactical curriculum, was confronted with an unprecedented challenge, unlike anything the Navy had ever attempted before: teaching captains to fundamentally override their most deeply ingrained survival instincts in situations where even a moment of hesitation would inevitably lead to death. Traditional naval training had consistently emphasized careful, measured decision-making, the meticulous weighing of various options, and thorough consultation with fellow officers. The revolutionary charging technique, however, demanded that captains make irrevocable commitments in under 3 seconds, based on fragmented information, all while their crews screamed urgent warnings, and every primal nerve urged an immediate retreat. Reed's ingenious solution was directly inspired by established aviation training methodologies. Fighter pilots, for instance, were rigorously taught to execute complex maneuvers such as snap rolls and inverted dives until these actions became entirely automatic, a form of muscle memory that effectively bypassed conscious thought processes. Reed skillfully adapted this concept to destroyer captains, utilizing a purpose-built training facility situated in Mammola Bay. Engineers meticulously installed pneumatic launch tubes on 5 strategically placed islands which were designed to fire phosphorescent-marked practice torpedoes, propelled by compressed air. These simulated torpedoes were, in actuality, weighted shells that produced glowing trails virtually identical to those left by the formidable long lances. Captains were subjected to simulated attacks that precisely replicated actual combat conditions. Profound darkness, multiple angles of approach, overlapping spreads of torpedoes, and even deliberate equipment failures. The intensive training regimen operated for an arduous 20 hours per day. Every single captain destined for the Pacific Fleet after February 1944 was required to spend a grueling 14 days at Mamala Bay, dedicating their time exclusively to torpedo evasion drills from the moment the sun set until it rose again. Reed's comprehensive program also incorporated a crucial psychological component that earlier training initiatives had conspicuously overlooked: the systematic desensitization to fear. On the very first day, captains observed the phosphorescent trails of the simulated torpedoes approaching, and almost every instinct within them screamed to turn away. Most hesitated, some issued incorrect orders, and a few even froze completely. Reed, however, refrained from criticizing these initial failures. He simply repeated the exercise. By day 3, captains had begun to stop hesitating. By day 7, the counterintuitive act of turning towards danger began to feel remarkably natural. By day 14, the charging response had become entirely automatic, a deeply ingrained reflex. The training program also meticulously included failure scenarios that Burke's actual combat operations had not fully explored. For instance, what if radar systems failed and lookouts only spotted torpedo wakes from a mere 800 yards, leaving less than 10 seconds until impact? Reed's decisive answer was, charge anyway, but significantly increase speed instead of attempting to turn. A bow-on profile at 800 yards was still considered superior to presenting a broadside at any distance. What if torpedo wakes appeared directly ahead, meaning that charging would involve driving straight into the path of the weapons? Reed's innovative solution was a hard turn to present the narrowest possible bow angle, typically between 15 and 20 degrees, followed by charging along the wake's track rather than attempting to cross it. These comprehensive techniques provided captains with viable options for every conceivable scenario, thereby eliminating the debilitating paralysis that often arose from encountering situations not explicitly covered by existing doctrinal guidelines. Reed also rigorously trained captains in the highly specialized skill of interpreting wake patterns, a crucial ability that distinguished mere competent execution from true mastery. A solitary wake, for instance, could signify either an actual long lance or merely a rogue wave. 3 wakes in a tight formation invariably indicated a spread fired from a single enemy ship. Conversely, 5 wakes with wider spacing suggested that multiple enemy ships were launching torpedoes simultaneously. Wakes that exhibited a noticeable curve implied that the torpedoes were actively adjusting their course, a clear indication that the Japanese had spotted the American destroyer and calculated a precise firing solution. Straight wakes, on the other hand, denoted hasty shots or long-range launches where the enemy was essentially guessing at the target's position. Captains learned to make these critical assessments in mere seconds and adjust their evasive responses accordingly. Curved wakes necessitated a more aggressive charging maneuver to overwhelm the torpedo's guidance systems, while straight wakes permitted the adoption of more conservative angles of approach. The profound psychological breakthrough ultimately stemmed from the relentless repetition and the inherent promise of survival. After 2 intensive weeks of continuously charging at simulated torpedoes, sometimes as many as 40 times each night, captains internalized a critical and undeniable truth. The torpedoes consistently missed when the technique was executed correctly. This newfound confidence fundamentally transformed their decision-making processes under extreme pressure. In early 1944, captains who faced real torpedoes for the very first time after completing the Manila Bay training reported experiencing feelings of calm and unwavering confidence during their evasion maneuvers. Emotional states that would have been utterly impossible to achieve in 1942. Reed's innovative training had not merely imparted a new technique, it had fundamentally rewired the emotional response to mortal danger itself. By June 1944, an impressive total of 127 destroyer captains had successfully completed the rigorous Manila Bay program. Their collective survival rate against torpedo attacks soared to an astounding 94%, a complete and dramatic reversal from the dismal 37% survival rate recorded in 1942. The remaining 6% failure rate was primarily attributed to equipment malfunctions, rather than errors in technique. When captains executed the charging maneuver correctly and precisely, survival was virtually guaranteed. The United States Navy had successfully systematized what Masbrugger had fortuitously discovered by accident, and what Burke had definitively proven in the crucible of combat. Charging toward incoming torpedoes was no longer an experimental tactic. It had been firmly established as standard operating procedure. The underlying physics that rendered the charging technique so effective boiled down to three interconnected problems that Japanese torpedo designers had crucially never anticipated American captains would exploit. The first of these was the guidance system's inherent reaction time. The Type 93 torpedo's gyroscopic mechanism updated its course corrections every 1.8 seconds, a remarkably fast rate for 1940s technology, but catastrophically slow when targets were closing at a combined speed of 84 knots. At such an accelerated combined velocity, a destroyer could travel a significant 253 feet between each guidance update. The torpedo's mechanical computer and intricate array of gears and gyros simply lacked the predictive capability to accurately determine where the target would be in the next 1.8 seconds, especially when that target was accelerating directly toward the weapon. The system was meticulously designed to track lateral movement, not head-on charges. The second critical impediment concerned the torpedo as turning radius, a limitation inherently imposed by hydrodynamics that even the most advanced engineering of the era could not surmount. Given that water is approximately 800 times denser than air, a torpedo propelling itself at a formidable 49 knots accrued an immense amount of kinetic energy and momentum. Consequently, any alteration to its course necessitated the weapon to exert its control surfaces against an overwhelming resistance from the surrounding water. Japanese engineers, in their pursuit of unparalleled straight-line velocity and extended operational range for the Type 93, had consciously embraced a trade-off, accepting a diminished capacity for maneuverability. To illustrate, a long lance required a substantial distance of roughly 420 yards to complete a precise 90-degree turn, an endeavor consuming approximately 15 seconds at its maximum speed. Therefore, when an American destroyer intersected a torpedo's trajectory and subsequently moved beyond its path, the weapon was presented with a stark choice, either to persist on its original forward heading, inevitably resulting in a miss, or to initiate a laborious turn, spending a precious 15 seconds in the process of reorienting itself. By the time such a corrective turn was finally executed, the swift destroyer would have advanced another 900 yards, rendering the torpedo incapable of ever closing the ever-widening gap. The third significant challenge revolved around the mechanism of target acquisition. The Long-Lance's sophisticated guidance system relied on a dual approach to pinpoint a target's location, acoustic detection, and the analysis of wake turbulence. Essentially, it was designed to discern the distinctive cavitation noise emanating from propellers and to perceive the disturbances created by a ship's passage through the water. These vital signals were most pronounced when originating from a vessel's stern quarter, where the propellers vigorously churned the water and the hull's displacement generated maximal turbulence. In stark contrast, a destroyer's bow produced a considerably fainter signature. The sleek, sharply angled entry design of the Fletcher-class destroyers, for instance, was specifically conceived to minimize wave resistance, which inherently translated into minimal water disturbance. When one of these destroyers adopted a bow-first charge directly towards incoming torpedoes, the weapon's sensitive sensors could only register a mere fraction of the acoustic signature it typically expected. This often led to instances where torpedoes inexplicably lost track of targets they were ostensibly positioned to strike, simply because the diminished acoustic presence rendered the target effectively inaudible to their guidance systems. We truly appreciate you staying with us. Please continue to watch the end of the video for more insights. We would be immensely grateful if you could show your support by giving us a like and subscribing to our channel. Also, we'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below about where you are from and what your thoughts are on the topic discussed in this video. These three distinct factors collectively orchestrated a progressive and ultimately catastrophic breakdown within the Japanese torpedo's internal decision-making algorithms. The guidance system, upon initially detecting a target, would meticulously compute an intercept course and irrevocably commit the torpedo to that specific trajectory. However, the moment the target unexpectedly surged forward in an aggressive charge, rather than veering away as anticipated, the system's predictive calculations were rendered entirely inaccurate. The torpedo would then attempt to institute a course correction, yet by the time this maneuver was finally executed, the nimble destroyer had already surged past its original position. The weapon, in a desperate bid, would endeavor to turn around. But the 15 crucial seconds expended in this elaborate repositioning created an insurmountable distance that it could not possibly overcome. Concurrently, as the destroyer's bow intersected the torpedo's track, the acoustic signature, which was vital for tracking, vanished, leaving the guidance system bereft of any clear or reliable directional data. Thus, these three disparate technical limitations converged, culminating in a complete and utter failure of the weapon's intended function. During their detailed examination of captured Long-Lances in 1943, American naval engineers unearthed yet another critical vulnerability: the torpedo, its inability to maintain a consistent depth at elevated speeds. The Type 93 employed a hydrostatic valve, a mechanism designed to regulate and sustain its preset operational depth. However, this valve's mechanical responsiveness proved insufficient, exhibiting a significant lag when the torpedo achieved speeds exceeding 45 knots. When these torpedoes executed sharp, tight turns, the powerful hydrodynamic forces acting upon them would inadvertently push them slightly deeper, sometimes by as much as 3 to 5 feet below their intended setting. Several American destroyers had previously reported observations of torpedoes passing harmlessly beneath their hulls during charging maneuvers. Engineers initially dismissed these occurrences as mere strokes of luck. Subsequent, more rigorous analysis, however, conclusively demonstrated that these were not random chances, but rather predictable outcomes dictated by the immutable laws of physics. When a long lance veered sharply to track an aggressively charging destroyer, it temporarily lost its precise depth control. If the destroyer's draft was sufficiently shallow, and indeed the majority of destroyers drew less than 18 feet of water, the torpedo could potentially pass directly underneath, even in situations that should have resulted in a direct and devastating impact. The cumulative impact of these inherent limitations meant that the Type 93 torpedo, despite its reputation as the most advanced weapon of its kind globally, was fundamentally optimized for engagement with targets that adhered to predictable behavioral patterns. Japanese naval doctrine, which heavily influenced the weapon's design, operated under the assumption that enemy vessels would invariably seek to maximize their distance, present the smallest possible approach angles, and attempt to outrun incoming ordnance. Every single design choice incorporated into the long lance meticulously reflected these foundational assumptions regarding enemy conduct. However, when American captains deliberately adopted the exact opposite strategy, minimizing their distance to the enemy, presenting the largest possible approach angles, and aggressively driving directly towards incoming weapons, they ingeniously exploited a profound disparity between the torpedo's theoretical design parameters and the actual dynamics of combat behavior. The Japanese had, in essence, engineered a weapon specifically designed to pursue and hunt fleeing prey. In a brilliant tactical reversal, Berkey's captains transformed their destroyers into audacious charging predators. The immutable principles of physics simply did not permit the sophisticated torpedoes to adapt to this wholly unanticipated and counterintuitive shift in enemy engagement strategy. The far-reaching influence of the charging technique extended significantly beyond the confines of World War II. Modern navies, meticulously studying this innovative tactic in the 1960s, recognized its profound significance as the very first successful human response to the burgeoning category of guided weapons, a class of armaments that would eventually come to dominate the landscape of naval warfare. The fundamental principle that Burke's captains so effectively demonstrated remained profoundly relevant when confronted with a weapon possessing superior speed and advanced tracking capabilities. The most effective strategy is to dramatically reduce its decision-making window rather than futilely attempting to outmaneuver or outrun it. This groundbreaking concept directly informed the subsequent development of close-in weapon systems, sophisticated electronic countermeasures, and the modern anti-torpedo doctrine that contemporary navies continue to employ with great success. Post-war, Soviet naval planners, meticulously scrutinizing American destroyer tactics gleaned from captured documents, integrated remarkably similar principles into their own anti-ship missile defense protocols throughout the Cold War era. The distinctive Russian kamikaze turn, a radical and aggressive course alteration directly towards incoming missiles, rather than away from them, drew its direct inspiration from Burke as pioneering charging technique. The underlying geometric rationale was identical: to present the absolute minimum possible profile, drastically reduce the weapon's tracking window, and compel it to process decisions at a pace far exceeding the capabilities of its guidance system. When Russian destroyers meticulously practiced this daring maneuver during Mediterranean exercises in the 1970s, astute American naval observers immediately recognized it as a direct evolution of their own groundbreaking World War II innovation. Reemerging in an evolved guise, the psychological dimension of this tactic proved equally impactful in military training across various domains, extending well beyond the traditional confines of naval warfare. Air Force fighter pilots in the 1950s, for instance, were instructed in similar counterintuitive maneuvers, learning to turn directly into incoming missile launches rather than attempting to evade them by turning away. This strategy cleverly exploited the weapon's minimum engagement ranges. Similarly, tank commanders meticulously studied the destroyer tactics to formulate effective doctrine for engaging advanced anti-tank missiles. The core principle manifested consistently across all these domains. Sophisticated weaponry, despite its advanced capabilities, possessed inherent vulnerable moments within its engagement sequence. Aggressive opponents who could accurately identify and exploit these fleeting opportunities could survive attacks that, on paper, appeared mathematically impossible to evade. Burke had unequivocally demonstrated that the perceived advantages of superior technology could, in fact, be decisively overcome by a deep and nuanced understanding of that very technology's intrinsic limitations. Contemporary anti-torpedo systems deployed aboard American destroyers now seamlessly integrate automated renditions of the charging principle. The AN/SLQ-25 Nixie decoy system, which has been in active service since 1991, utilizes towed acoustic devices that precisely mimic a ship's unique sound signature, while the vessel itself simultaneously executes maneuvers designed to minimize its profile. This effectively represents an automated, highly refined execution of Burke's original manual technique. The very newest iterations of these systems, such as the surface ship torpedo defense, ingeniously combine the use of advanced decoys with sophisticated evasive maneuvers that strategically prioritize a bow-on positioning. The computer-controlled responses within these cutting-edge systems meticulously follow decision trees that Burke's captains painstakingly developed and refined through arduous trial and error back in 1943. While 70 years of relentless technological advancement have undeniably refined the precision and speed of execution, the fundamental underlying geometry of the defensive strategy has remained remarkably unchanged. By 1952, the Battle of Cape St. George had become a mandatory subject of study at the prestigious Naval War College, not merely for its invaluable tactical lessons, but for the profound insights it offered into the dynamics of innovation under immense pressure. Burke, with remarkable ingenuity, had transformed what initially appeared to be a desperate accident into a systematized and highly effective counter-tactic. He achieved this through rigorous, disciplined analysis and subsequently disseminated it through aggressive training regimens, all accomplished within a mere 12 months, and notably without formal authorization from the entrenched naval bureaucracy. Modern military officers continue to analyze this pivotal case as an exemplary instance of bottom-up innovation, demonstrating how solutions originating from the front lines can succeed spectacularly where rigid top-down doctrine has failed. The charging technique powerfully illustrated that junior officers, being closest to the actual problems, frequently perceive solutions that senior staff planners often overlook, and furthermore, that institutional resistance to counterintuitive ideas can ultimately be overcome by the sheer, undeniable force of irrefutable results. Decades after the cessation of hostilities, Japanese naval officers, in interviews, expressed a grudging yet undeniable respect for the ingenious American adaptation. Commander Hara, whose torpedo tactics had dominated naval engagements in 1942, famously articulated in his 1961 memoir that the Americans learned faster than we anticipated. We designed tactics for predictable opponents. When they stopped being predictable, our advantage disappeared. The formidable long lance, despite its inherent superiority as a weapon throughout the conflict, proved ultimately ineffectual when adversaries adamantly refused to conform to the fundamental assumptions underpinning its tactical deployment. The Japanese command never successfully devised an effective countermeasure to the charging technique. Their response was largely confined to simply firing a greater volume of torpedoes, in a desperate hope that statistical probability alone would somehow overcome the tactical brilliance of American geometry. The charging technique's extraordinary success rate, boasting a 94% survival rate among captains who had been rigorously trained in its application, stands as one of the most dramatic and consequential tactical reversals in the annals of naval history. Within a remarkably brief period of 18 months, American destroyers underwent a profound transformation, evolving from being vulnerable, helpless targets of Japanese torpedoes to becoming virtually immune against their devastating power. No other innovation during the entirety of the Pacific War produced such a complete and decisive transformation in such an abbreviated time frame. This ingenious technique was directly responsible for saving hundreds of ships and, by extension, thousands of lives. More significantly, it profoundly restored the confidence of destroyer captains in their ability to survive, a renewed self-assurance that directly translated into the adoption of far more aggressive and daring tactics across the entire theater of operations. Vessels that were no longer burdened by the existential threat of torpedoes could close to gunnery range with greater impunity, pursue enemy targets with increased ferocity, and undertake calculated risks that ultimately devastated Japanese supply lines. Burke's singular innovation, therefore, propagated its influence, rippling through and fundamentally reshaping every conceivable aspect of the naval campaign. The enduring legacy of a pivotal naval campaign continues to resonate through the annals of maritime history, vividly encapsulated by humble yet profoundly significant artifacts. Presently, the meticulously crafted tactical reference cards, once clutched by the officers serving under Commander Arleigh Burke, occupy a place of honor within the hallowed halls of the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington. These unassuming, laminated 3.5-inch cards, adorned with their precise hand-drawn diagrams and intricately calculated angles, serve as tangible relics of a monumental turning point. They symbolize the precise juncture when the American destroyer fleet, previously compelled to evade the relentless onslaught of Japanese torpedoes, dramatically reversed its posture, instead initiating a bold and aggressive charge directly into the very heart of the threat. This shift marked a fundamental redefinition of engagement strategy. This radical change in approach was not merely an act of reckless bravery, it was grounded in a profound understanding of naval physics and tactical ingenuity. The underlying scientific principles that rendered this audacious maneuver effective remain as constant and immutable today as they were during the heat of battle. Similarly, the extraordinary courage demanded of those sailors and their commanders, who willingly steered their vessels into the path of incoming danger, has not diminished in its profound historical significance or its inspirational power. This strategic pivot, a calculated risk that transformed defensive evasion into offensive engagement, fundamentally altered the dynamics of the Pacific Naval Theater, demonstrating a new paradigm for confronting formidable adversaries at sea. It was a testament to the innovative spirit and unwavering resolve of the United States Navy. What was once a revolutionary, almost counterintuitive battle technique has, over the decades, seamlessly integrated itself into the very fabric of modern naval doctrine. This once groundbreaking method, initially a closely guarded innovation, has transcended its origins to become a foundational tenet of destroyer warfare, as indispensable and inherent to the operation of these formidable vessels as their very construction. It is a vital piece of operational wisdom, meticulously transmitted from one commanding officer to the next, diligently passed down through successive generations of naval leadership. This continuous educational lineage ensures that the lessons learned from Burke's innovative tactics continue to inform and guide contemporary naval strategy, cementing its place as an essential component of maritime combat readiness. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic.